Hola, buenos días, ¿cómo están? Les damos la bienvenida al evento de Primavera de la LAOUC. Soy Rolando Carrasco y represento a los grupos de usuarios de Latinoamérica. Y vamos a dar inicio al evento. Vamos a dar una breve presentación de introducción sobre el evento, de la agenda que vamos a tener estos 2 días, 9 y 10 de noviembre. Y pues vamos a dar inicio. No sé si Luzma me puede ayudar a compartir pantalla para que se vea la presentación y que podamos dar inicio. Sí, ahí se ve la presentación. Bueno, si no se ve la presentación, pues le damos la bienvenida a todos. Vamos a empezar con Connor, que él nos acompaña desde varios eventos en años pasados. Es un constante speaker de nuestros eventos en Latinoamérica y le agradecemos como siempre. Él habla inglés, así que pues vamos a dar inicio a su presentación. Yo traía un material, no sé por qué no se pueda transmitir, pero pues la intención es que les recordemos la agenda, que es el día de hoy, 9 de noviembre, y mañana 10 de noviembre. Prácticamente estamos transmitiendo presentaciones desde las 8 de la mañana, horario de la Ciudad de México, y pues diferentes temas que son, mira, ya aquí apareció la presentación, diferentes temas que son, que van a ser entregados por diferentes speakers que representan en una buena mayoría a gente de Latinoamérica, desde México hasta Brasil, speakers que ustedes conocen y que seguramente están interesados en escuchar sus pláticas. También hay speakers de otras regiones, de otros continentes, tal es el caso de Connor. Temas diversos, tanto de Apex como bases de datos, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, Java, desarrollo Cloud Native, Machine Learning, en fin, hay una agenda bastante completa en este evento de primavera. Hay que reconocer el esfuerzo de los coordinadores a este evento, en particular a nuestros patrocinadores Certificatic y Novacom, y bueno, a gente de los grupos de usuarios que ha estado pues muy interesada en generar este evento. Ya a fin de año, pues con la pandemia y demás, se nos había hecho un poco complicado hacer la coordinación. Sin embargo, pues el reconocimiento a la gente que lo ha coordinado, en particular a Ronald Vargas, que tuvo la iniciativa de hacerlo. Así que pues también hay que mencionarlo y agradecerle que tuvo esta iniciativa de coordinar este evento. La agenda que tenemos para hoy y mañana la pueden ver en esta dirección. Si todavía no han decidido qué pláticas atender, aquí pueden ver prácticamente todas pues las sesiones y los horarios. Hay 2 tracks en paralelo, eso considérenlo por si les interesa una u otra, pues hay 2 en paralelo, así que tienen que decidir sobre qué track entrar. Obviamente se puede mover de uno a otro, pero bueno, insisto, hay 2 en paralelo. Y pues ayúdenos a compartir información del evento en las redes sociales. Tenemos como hashtag el Primavera LAOUC. Hagan mención de que están en el evento. Si pueden sacar una foto desde donde estén tomando las conferencias y compartirlo a la comunidad, eso nos ayudaría. Pueden utilizar Twitter o Facebook, cualquiera de las redes sociales pueden utilizarlas. Y bueno, regularmente en los eventos en vivo pues, se acostumbra a sacar una selfie ahí en el lugar del evento con el speaker saca una, pero pues aquí obviamente no se puede. Sin embargo, sí pueden sacar, pues no sé, algún screenshot de lo que estén viendo y hacer algún comentario. Todo lo que puedan contribuir en las redes sociales, evidentemente es bienvenido, así que no dejen de hacerlo. Así que compartan la experiencia del evento, por favor. Y bueno, pues no queda más que agradecer por acompañarnos. Hay 2 días llenos de pláticas en relación a tecnología de Oracle. Aprovechenlo. Les recuerdo que pueden etiquetar sus publicaciones con este Primavera LAOC. Así que, pues sin más, vamos a arrancar el evento. Vamos a pasar a inglés para hacer una breve introducción a Connor y para que él ya dé arranque al evento de primavera de LAOC. Thank you for being with us. We really appreciate your support in all our events. I'm privileged you being with us, even in present now online. We are very thankful for having you here. So thank you. And We can start, Connor. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you can see me. Hola, mi nombre es Connor McDonald. Lo siento, no hablo español. That's the end of my Spanish for this session. Let me share my screen. Oh, someone is already sharing their screen, it says. I need someone to stop sharing so I can share mine. Hello, anyone? I can't share my screen. This might make life a little bit difficult, especially with my limited Spanish.
Please. Or maybe, Rolando, can you please stop sharing your screen?
Doesn't. I don't know. I will drop off in order if I'm doing that.
Okay, thank you. I will drop off also.
Okay, there we go. Let's have a look. Okay, hopefully you can still hear me. Hopefully you can see me. And most importantly, hopefully you can see the slides. So we've got about 50 minutes. Let's talk about 21C, why and why not. This is how you get in touch with me. You can, if you want just casual technical conversation, please reach out to me on Twitter. If you like longer form content, you can get to me on my blog. Or if you like video, you can go to my YouTube channel. I like talking of any kind of technology. Similarly, if you like very long forms and just me talking to various members of the community, you can go to my podcast as well. My apologies. It is also exclusively in English. Before we begin, something I've been saying to everyone every time I've done a talk for the last 2 years, please let's focus on following our local laws, get ourselves vaccinated. As much as I like talking to you over a webcam, at least it gets a chance to talk, I would much rather be there. Every time I've been in Latin America, whether it be Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, etc., the hosts have always been fantastic, the people even more so, and I would love to be back there in 2022 or beyond. So let's get ourselves all healthy around the world so our communities can be back as stronger than ever. There's 2 important messages I'd like to convey in today's talk, and if you take away nothing else, it's just these 2 important messages. The first one is you must use 21C. That's the first message. And the second message is you must not use 21C. Now, that might make me sound a little bit like a hypocrite, but hopefully I can explain why those 2 things are important through the next 50 minutes. I'm not a hypocrite, I promise. Let me explain why. Here's the first reason why you should not use 21C, which might sound strange given that this is a talk on 21C. The moment 21C came out, I started getting WhatsApp messages, I started getting telegrams, Twitter DMs, etc., from all these people saying, oh yes, we want to learn about 21C. Every time there's a new release of the Oracle database, people get very, very excited. But it's important to realize the way we do releases inside Oracle. We have long-term support releases and we have innovation releases. 21C is an innovation release. Lots of new features for people that need them, but it is a much shorter time frame of support. If you're a business that currently does upgrades on a regular basis, there's no problems with that. You can use 21C today. But if you're a business which is perhaps much more common, that doesn't like upgrading, they like extending the amount of time they stay on one release as long as possible, then 21C is definitely not for you. You should be on 19C if you're one of those places. Heaps of customers I know are still running literally 11G, even though it's out of support. You should move to 19C and not move to 21C because it is really about fast upgrade cycles. 19C will be supported for the next decade. That's the release you want to go on. So for the vast majority of production applications, you are probably going to want to be on 19C. Important to note, because of this, not all platforms will even get a 21C release. I don't think there will be an AIX release and a couple other platforms as well. This is about innovation, and particular platforms will not have a 21C release. Let's now talk about why you must use 21C. Having just told you that 19C is probably where you want to be, let me explain why you must use 21C. And I'll give you 2 examples of this. Here is my 21C instance, and as you can see, I've gone to Oracle Home, Network Admin, where all the SQLnet files always sit. I've got a TNS entry called MyDB for my database. Let's see what happens when I try connect to that database. I get error 12154, and this is probably the first error that everybody gets when they start using 21C. Why? Because if you go to this link, it's a link to the Oracle documentation. And in 21C, the default software installation is what we call the read-only Oracle Home that came in 18C. The ROOH stands for read-only Oracle Home. The network configuration files go in a different place. I was on Stack Overflow the other day, and you can see people are having this problem all the time because they're unfamiliar with this new software layout. This is why it's important, even if you don't run 21C in production, that you must use 21C regularly in your environment, because when 23C comes along, which is the next long-term support release, you want to know how it's going to work, how the structures will be, what the features are, etc. 21C is a great way of learning what 23C will be like. Here's a second example which is catching people out. Up until 21C, you could choose a case-insensitive password for sysdba. So I could set my password to my secret password, and then I could try connect with my secret password all in lowercase. That will work in all versions of Oracle except for 21C. Even if you specify ignore case equals y, that parameter now is ignored itself. There is only case-sensitive passwords in 21C. So that is a couple of examples of why it's so critical to get 21C installed, perhaps in your development or your sandbox environments, just to start learning how to use it. Especially if you haven't gone to pluggable database yet, you definitely want to start playing with 21C because that is the future. You must use a pluggable database from 21C onwards. And the best way to learn 21C is with 21C Express Edition. It's also available now. It has almost all the features of 21C. It's 100% free. It's very lightweight. You can run it inside Docker. Lots of goodies there inside 21C Express Edition. For the rest of the time, I'm going to do what we would call in a restaurant sense a degustation, a little tiny sample of each feature. Every one of these features could be an entire topic in its own right, and some of them are later on in this conference. But I'm just going to touch on lots of features as fast as possible. I actually have 21 features in this slide deck. Hopefully we can get to all 21. That might be ambitious, but we'll do our best. So number 1, probably the most exciting thing you've heard about 21C is blockchain. There's blog posts and articles and videos, hundreds and hundreds of people all talking about blockchain. But the reality is, I don't think a lot of people will use blockchain in the short term. The use cases are fairly niche. But one thing that is very, very popular about blockchain tables is this facility. Namely, one of the things that many businesses want to stop is how do we stop the DBA from corrupting the data? We have privilege controls from roles and securities like a normal Oracle database, but nothing can stop the sysdba from changing the data. They could easily increase their salary by 10% or 20%. In the past, the only way to stop that would be to use something like Data Vault. Now, Data Vault is a fantastic piece of technology, but it's a very robust, fully featured solution. It can be quite complicated because it is a massive security solution. It's perhaps too much just to stop DBAs from updating tables without it being audited. So perhaps a better thing than the blockchain table will be the immutable table, which also comes in 21C. An immutable table is simply a table that cannot be tampered with. The only thing you can do is insert into it. So we can see we create an immutable table and we can nominate when it can be dropped and how long before you can do any deletes. Once you've done that, the table is now tamper-proof. Here's some data in the table. I try to do an update in my table. I'm not allowed to change anything, even though I'm logged on as sys. So while blockchain tables have a specific requirement, I think perhaps a more popular option in 21C will be immutable tables, simply to implement that facility to guarantee that no one, including DBAs, will be able to change the data. Number 2, we have some new plan tools coming in 21C, just some ways of being able to compare them. Here I can do 2 explain plans. One is setting statement ID for P1 and one is setting statement ID for P2. One's a full scan of scott.emp, one's an index. Once I've explained those 2 plans, we have some new packages inside DBNSX plan to actually compare the plans. You simply pass in the 2 statement IDs, P1 and P2, and it will print out a nice report of information about how to compare the 2 plans and how they differed. It's a nice way of looking at 2 plans and deciding which one might be better, especially when the plans get more complicated. We've got compare explain. You can also do compare cursor, which takes 2 plans out of the library cache and do a similar comparison and get a nice report. Number 3, string size and pluggables. This is just a nice little utility which you might find useful. As you're probably aware, in Oracle 12, we introduced the concept of larger varchar 2s. Instead of being 4,000 bytes, they can now be 32,767 bytes, or 32K. The problem there is, what if you have a pluggable database in one environment where the strings are large, and you want to plug that database into another environment where the strings may not be large? In this particular pluggable database, my max string size is extended, but what I can do is I can check that database to see if there are any tables that have a string size larger than 4K, which is the standard size. So in this particular pluggable database, even though I'm allowing people to have a 32K varchar 2, there actually no one has done it so far. So I could take this pluggable and plug it into a standard sized pluggable database. If I then came along and created a table with a varchar 2 6000, which is obviously more than the normal standard size, now when I run that routine, it tells me I won't be able to plug this database into a standard size pluggable because it says I've got a table called big string with a column called X, and it says the physical column exceeds the standard length. So this is a nice little utility to make sure that when you have different max string sizes across pluggables, that you'll still be able to plug databases in when you're doing cross-database cloning, etc. Number 4, friendly analytic views. If you've not seen analytic views, they came in, I think, in 18C, maybe 19C. And it's a fantastic It's a fantastic method for data warehouse professionals. People who use data warehouses often have to write incredibly complicated SQLs to do the kind of trend analysis. They have a lot of analytic functions. They have a lot of aggregations because they want to get totals by month and by day and by year, etc. Analytic views mask that facility because you define it in metadata, and then a query like you see here is actually doing a lot of aggregation and trend analysis. It just doesn't look like it. This particular syntax says, take my raw data. I want to do some aggregation both by time and by product. I want the aggregation to be by year, and I want the aggregation about the product to be at the department level. But notice there's no sums, there's no group bars, etc. That's all managed by the analytic view. And in fact, if we take that query we just saw there and pump it into expand SQL text, one of the utilities that came in back in Oracle 12, which lets you show you the real SQL that's being run, you get an idea for how complicated the SQL really is. It is incredibly sophisticated. And this is why analytic views are quite good. They hide that complexity away from users. However, because it is generating incredibly complicated SQLs, sometimes those have some issues with performance. in 21C, we have a new package called DBMS AV Tune, which will analyze your analytic views and then make some recommendations in terms of how you might want to do some caching, either with result caching or materialized views, and also give analysis as to what columns might be added to make things more efficient. So whilst they hide complexity, we have this new package now which lets you dig into that complexity to come up with more efficient analytic views. If you haven't seen analytic views, head over to livesql.oracle.com and you can check out some of the examples there. Just search for analytic views. Number 5. Gradual password rollover. This is the ability for a database account to have 2 passwords at the same time, an old password and a new password. We implement it with profiles. So I've created a profile here called Let's Be Gentle, and it has a rollover time of 4, which means I have 4 days in which I can use both passwords. I create a user called Demo. His current password is my current password, but he is assigned to this rollover profile. And as you can see, we can connect with the current password. If I if I log on as a DBA and change that user's password, I've called it pesky auditor's new password, because the most common reason we need to change passwords is because auditors have introduced a security policy saying that you must rotate the passwords. Because he has a password rollover profile, I can connect as the new password. That might make sense because that's the new password I was just given, but I can also connect as the old password for up to 4 days. So I can use both. Therefore, I'm not going to get those invalid password errors for 4 days. It gives me time to roll those passwords over. You can tell which password was used if you look at your unified audit trail and you've activated that. You can see here we have the logon information that says the first time I logged on, I used the new password and I used the 12C authentication method. And the second time I logged in, I used the old password and I still use the 12C authentication method as well. You might be thinking, well, I should say there's one more thing. You can see if a account is currently in that rollover period by looking at the account status. This account is open, but it's currently in that password rollover 4-day period. You might be thinking, who cares? Why is this such a big deal? Why don't we just tell people their password is expired, make them change their password and be done? Why do we need to have this rollover period? It's particularly useful when it comes to passwords that are hard-coded for application service. And a lot of us have these. We have the kind of logons that get used for connection pooling. Normally, we would store this in a wallet such that you can see there on the left, when we connect, we never use a password. We just do connect / at the application because those details are stored in the wallet. The problem with the current password expiration facility is normally, because these are application server accounts, we just never expire them, which obviously sometimes gets us in trouble with auditors. The problem is if we go change the password to a new password, then the only way we can change all of these application server passwords at the same time is to take our application down. We take the application down, we change the password, change the configuration files, and then start the application up again. That's a problem because it implies an outage. Having password rollover means we can change the password and slowly work through each of the app servers and make sure they actually will pick up the new password in time. We don't have to have any outages. Number 6, safer data pump. Now, what do we mean by making data pump safe? As we know, with any database, the moment you take data out of the database and store it somewhere, whether it's a backup, whether it's data pump, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet, it is less secure. Let me give you an example of what someone might do to a data pump export. I've done just a normal data pump export here. I'm just exporting the Scott schema, just the normal Scott schema with employee, department, etc. But then what I've done is I've used up a hex editor and gone in and literally just edited the data pump file. By default, strings information is just stored in plain text in your data pump file. So I've gone in and changed Martin to Connor. Once I've done that, I can now import that data file. It just goes into my database with no problems whatsoever. And what have I done? all of a sudden, the employee 7654 that used to be called Martin is now called Connor. That is the risk of having data outside the database. Anyone with a appropriate editor, just a hex editor, will be able to manipulate the data and you'll never know. In 21C, we can now guard against this. As you take an export data pump, you can specify checksum equals yes. This will apply a checksum to the data pump information at the end of the data pump. And then when you come to import the data file, you can choose verify checksum equals yes. If the checksum does not match, you get an error, file checksum error in the dump file, and you are not allowed to import it. It's important to realize you must specify that parameter to actually have the checksum checked. The reason we do this is you may have a checksum error, but still choose to import that data perhaps into another database to do some checking. So if you leave that parameter off, even if the data pump file has been messed with, you'll still be allowed to import it. So be aware that if you want to guarantee that the checksum is checked, you must do verify checksum equals yes on the import data pump. Number 7. In 21C, we have more database resident logic. Now, what do I mean by logic that is database resident? I'm talking about a very cool invention called the multilingual engine, which is part of the Graal virtual machine. What that means is the languages you currently have in the database are obviously SQL and PL/SQL. But now, and also, if you're using the Java machine, you can run some Java inside the database as well. However, with MLE, we can now extend that to multiple languages. And the first one we have is JavaScript. So using an anonymous block like you can see there, I can actually have some I can have some JavaScript, and I can ask the database to run it. And I'm not a JavaScript programmer, but I know that console.log spits something out to the console. That becomes the equivalent of DBMS output. So output pops. You can also run SQL directly from the JavaScript MLE engine. So in this case, I've got some SQL statement here. I choose the default connection, which is the connection I'm currently in, and it will actually spit out some information there. So I've run a JavaScript program to actually interact with the database. Once again, you might be thinking, why would I need that? Surely with SQL and PL/SQL, I can pretty much do any kind of database logic I could ever think of. I think one of the benefits here is if you think about the amount of stuff out there, the amount of code that's floating around the internet that's been written in JavaScript that has also now been checked and is secure, etc., is we have so many utilities and libraries out there, mainly that have been built for Node, but now will be available from inside the database should you want them. For example, a very popular library is the validator JavaScript library, which lets you do things like validate whether an email address is a correct format. So once you load this into your database, you'll be able to run, for example, an isEmail function, isEmail valid function. There are so many libraries out there in JavaScript. There are ones that do YAML formatting. There are ones that do, for example, encryption, ones that generate GUIDs, etc. All these things for which JavaScript libraries have existed for years are now going to be possible for you to exploit from inside the database. So I think the opportunities there are very, very large. Here's another example that someone showed me. You can actually use JavaScript to generate QR codes. So you could actually have a database routine that actually sends you back a QR code straight from the database, which will be useful in something like Apex. Excuse me. Number 8, JSON just got enormously easier in 21C. We now have a new data type called the JSON data type. It's a binary data type that is far more efficient than it's just storing information in a TLOB or varchar2. It's just as easy to access, so you simply can insert strings in JSON format. That's fine. And if you describe that table in SQL plus 21C, it'll say that it's a JSON column. Any older clients will say the column is undefined, but it'll still work just fine. All the normal JSON facilities become easier and just work as normal. So you can use JSON value to extract information out. You can also use the dot notation as well. We have some new data type declaratives as well. So you can take, for example, a date format that's stored as a string in JSON, but you can bring it back to you as a date, for example, or a timestamp. You can easily pretty up JSON data using JSON serialized with the pretty keyword, so it becomes out in nice, pretty format. You have PL/SQL access as well. So you can now have the JSON object type, and you can grab information from a JSON data type. You can make changes to it. For example, I've said put status silver, so I can put new elements in it, and I can even call that from inside the database as well. So this one, I actually added the tag status silver because I did that put there. We can also do really easy DML now on JSON. So we have these nice facilities in just a normal update statement, lets you do things like change, merge, add, append, etc., just by using simple primitives. And you can see here that I actually changed the zip code from 6000 to 6001. I corrected the spelling of my first name, which was spelled wrong, and I even added a new array, create on missing. So very easy to run DML now to actually update fragments of JSON data. The other nice thing that's come in 21C is one of the problems that we had previously was if you had complicated arrays of JSON inside a particular row, then finding particular information would take a full search index. Now we have this thing called a multi-value index in 21C. So even though this is a single row with multiple values, this multi-value index will be able to find them. So I've created a multi-value index on the zip code. So even though there are 2 zip codes for this one particular row, when I query for this particular row using JSON exists, it'll actually find that one row, even though it needed only one of the zip codes. So it's an index that contains multiple values in the index for a single row. That's why we call a multi-value index. Number 9, the attention log. When you log on to 21C and you go into your RDMS trace folder, rather than seeing just the all trace files and the alert log, there's a new log file now called the attention log as well. And the reason we've added it is you can probably get a hint from looking at the size of these files. Way back in Oracle 7, when I first started using Oracle, or Oracle 6, the alert log was fairly small. It contained just critical events. But as we demand more and more information, the alert log now contains so much more stuff. Very little of the alert log information is critical in terms of a database disaster. Most of it is just information which might be very useful should you ever need to raise a support call and you've had some sort of problem. The issue with having so much data in the alert log is how do you make a decision as to when you need to call someone out nowadays? If you have an Oracle error in the alert log, is that a disaster or is it just a piece of information that might be useful? It's very hard to tell the difference. The attention log makes up for that shortfall. For a start, it's a well-formatted file. So it's always in JSON and it's actually formatted nicely, so it's very easy to parse. Also, it has particular tags and that are always used for every single message. It contains the type, which is an error, warning, or notification. So you have classifications of whether it is something bad or just information. You have the urgency, which obviously means, do I need to page someone or can I look at this maybe tomorrow morning? You have the scope. Does it affect just a session? Does it affect an entire pluggable? Does it affect an entire database? And one of the nice things is we've tried to put in the target person. So does this particular information in the attention log, is it best suited to go to an application developer? Should it go to a cluster admin? Is it a problem with the grid control? Should it go to a pluggable admin or is it CDB wide? So with these 4 attributes, you're getting much better guidance as to what you should do with information in the attention log. Number 10, PL/SQL. I must admit, we got a little bit carried away here with extending some of the facilities in PL/SQL. Back in Oracle 19 and before, if you wanted to do 3 different sets of iterations through a loop, so in this case, we want to go from 1 to 10, 100 to 110, 200, you had to write 3 loops. In 21C, you can just put them on the one line. I want to go from 1 to 10, 100 to 110, 200 to 210. If you wanted to go through a loop in jumps and sort of increments, you had to do it from first principles, just effectively loop through every single row and then decide which ones are interesting. In 21C, you can now do it with the by clause, go from 1 to 20 in jumps of 3. One of the interesting things here is, what if I want to go in increments of less than 1? So in this case, if I'm trying to go by 0.5, I still get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's not a bug. You need to remember the iteration loop, the variable here has always been an integer. But in 21C, you get control over that. I can say I want this variable to be a number 3, 1. Now when I go from 1 to 10 by 0.5, you can see it iterates by 0.5 because this is now a number, not an integer. Similarly, when it comes to accessing data from sets, this is how we used to assign things to sets, to associative arrays in 19C. We also had this somewhat slightly better shorthand where you could nominate the index followed by the value. And that's both of these are available in 19C. But in 21C, you can simply say like a nested table. So even though this is an associated array, you can now assign it in the same way that you used to be able to assign nested tables. If you want to copy elements, say from one list from one array to another, in this case, I want to copy every second element from S1 to S2. This is how I would do it in 19C and before. In 21C, you can actually put for loops inside the declaration. So I want to assign all the values 2 to 10 by 2, so 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, picking out from S1 to I. So once again, much easier, shorter iteration code. As we know, every array has a key, being the index, and the values. This is how we used to iterate through a sparse array in 19C and before. You would start with the first entrance, and then you would go to the next one, and you would loop around until you ran out. In 21C, it's just for I in indices of, and that will spit out 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and I can spit out the values. I don't even have to reference the array. I can actually say for I in the values of. So rather than being the index values, I actually get the values of the array itself can come out. If I want both, I can even do for X and Y in pairs of S2, which gives me both the index value, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and the actual value of the array item itself, 20, 40, 60, 80, I think it's 1,000. Yeah. So lots and lots of flexibility when it comes to looping through iterations. What if I want to, for example, go through loop variables that jump in value? In this case, I want to go through the powers of 2. I want to go 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. I would have to do it from first principles. In 21C, you can now do it directly on the line. Start with 1, repeat multiplying it by 2 until we hit 1024. Similarly, if I want to go through, very complicated looping structures, I can do that as well. I can simply keep having multiple looping structures that'll simply keep running until I end up with an exiting condition. Excuse me. Even when it comes to looping through SQL or ref cursors, we can do it much easier. This is how we used to do it back in 19C and before. You would open a ref cursor, you would declare some record types, then you would declare a nested table type or a PL/SQL array, and then you would fetch, bulk collect, etc. Lots of code there to loop through a ref cursor. In 21C, you simply go for R number in values of. Because this query only returns a single number, I can simply do it with a single loop. If the query returns lots of different things, all I need to do is declare a record type, and then I simply say for R record type in that ref cursor as well, and I can loop through. So all of a sudden, looping through a ref cursor is trivial in 21C. Even if that is dynamic SQL, here as I have a SQL string here, I declare my record type, I can even do for R in values of, and then execute immediate that dynamic SQL. And I can even add predicates to the loop clause as well. enormous power coming in PL/SQL looping in 21C. Number 11, keep an eye on the time. We might not get to 21, but we'll do our best. A quick segue on number 11 here. If you're using DataGuard, if you're not using DataGuard, I think every production database should have a DataGuard equivalent because it's effectively free. And the reason I would say DataGuard is free is everyone always has a production server and a non-production server. Almost every business I've ever worked in my life has at the bare minimum 2 licensed Oracle servers. So wherever your production database is, you can have a DataGuard copy of that on your non-production server. Because they're already licensed for Oracle, it costs you nothing. And the value of having a DataGuard copy of production is enormous, not just for disaster recovery, but the ability to do experiments. You have snapshot standby. You have the facility to open that database, do experiments on it, use it for backups, use it for patch testing, use it for application deployment testing. So many options when you have a copy of production that you can easily resync. The reason a lot of people don't have DataGuard copies of their production is because of this. The amount of steps you have to go through in order to get your database ready for DataGuard. And once it's ready, then you have to go through a whole lot of steps to actually build your DataGuard database. It's complicated. People think it's tough to manage, and therefore they don't do it. In 21C, we have the easiest DataGuard ever. You simply do prepare database for DataGuard. Now, there are a few documentation issues, so I thought I'd show you a quick example of where you need to make some changes because the documentation has a couple of bugs at the moment. This is how you would prepare a production database for DataGuard. You type in prepare database for DataGuard, and then you nominate what the unique name will be, where the recovery information will go, what the broker information will be. This is cut and pasted straight from the documentation, and you'll get a syntax error. This is because the documentation said you should use that, but you should actually not have the DG in front of it. And then when you fix that, you'll find you still get an error because you're not meant to have broker config file 1, you're meant to have brokered config file _1. But once you do that, it does all the work for you. You type in this 3, 4, or 5 lines of command. It sets all the initialization parameters. It changes all the archive log mode. It sets all the flashback retention target. It sets flashback mode on it. It sets recovery file destination. It creates your DataGuard broker configuration. It creates your standby Rudy logs, does all of that for you. And then it says, yes, this production database is ready to have a standby version built of it, all with just a 1-line command in your DataGuard broker. Now it's trivial to create standby databases. Number 12. If you've got DataGuard, then if you've got Active DataGuard, which I will admit is separately licensed, you have a lot of better facilities now in Active DataGuard. In 12C, if you're running Active DataGuard, when you want it to fail over, that it failed over fine, but you lost your buffer cache and you lost your result cache. Therefore, a lot of slowdown starts when people start using the system again. In 19C, we improved this. We kept the buffer cache. So now whatever's in the buffer cache will still be there when you fail over to your Active DataGuard node. And in 21C, we now keep the result cache as well, which is fantastic if you're running things like a data warehouse. So now when you do a failover over from your primary to your DataGuard node, pretty much if you're running Active DataGuard, people are hardly going to notice any impact in performance and change. They'll just seamlessly fail over. Number 13 is better Active DataGuard failover. The biggest issue with doing a failover, whether it's a rack failover or DataGuard failover, is what I call this moment of prayer. And that is, you need to fail over. You're about to press the button saying, yes, I want to move all my applications from this primary node to the DataGuard node. And you're going, I really hope this works. And you sit there and you think, because if it doesn't, I'm going to be in big trouble. Nowadays, in 21C, we have a validate command. You can actually tell the DataGuard broker to go make sure that a failover is going to work. Make sure the primary is not ahead of the standby. Make sure the client's going to be failed over. You get to do a validation before you actually have to do it for real. So no more prayer involved. There's a whole heap of other data guard broker improvements as well, but we're short on time. Number 14, in-memory licensing. Now, one of the things in memory, I think, is one of the greatest inventions we ever made. I think out of all the features in the Oracle database, probably after read consistency, it's probably the most game-changing feature that is out there. And there's a very simple reason that a lot of people are not aware of this, and that's because you have to pay for it. It's a separately licensed option, and therefore people often haven't used it. But from 21C and even in 19C now, there's an in-memory feature that everybody gets for free, and that is this thing called the base level. You set in-memory force to base_level, and you can have up to 16 gigs of in-memory for free with no license fee. 16 gig might not sound like much, but don't forget, in-memory does compression. For example, I can create a table of customer products with that 1200 thing, customers, 10,000 customers, and then I artificially created this table called customer sales, which is 250 million rows in size. That's not very small. But even a table like that only consumes about 12.8 gigabytes. When I put that into my in-memory store, I think it came into about 5 gigabytes, so well under 16 gig. Here's a query before I put that data into the in-memory store. It's a complicated join, but across the 3 tables, it took 75 seconds. I put those 3 tables into my free 16 gigabytes of in-memory, and now it takes 2 seconds. From 75 seconds down to 2 seconds with absolutely no code changes or index changes, etc. That is the kind of excitement you're going to get from your users when you give them this free in-memory 16 gig allocation. If you have massive tables, you could, for example, put the most recent petitions into the in-memory area for free. Number 15, in-memory is now also more flexible. Here's a table called employees or big employees. It's got an extra column called description. I might put some text about each employee, about, for example, maybe what office they're in, what their phone number is, etc., etc. Just meaning, free format text. In this case, my table has got I've got 31 million rows in my big employee table. Obviously a big organization. Because the description is free text, I might choose not to put it into the in-memory store because I don't want to chew up, for example, my 16 gigs or whatever my allocation of in-memory is. So the normal columns are in the in-memory store, but my description is not in the in-memory store. In 19C and below, if I run a query that uses all the in-memory columns, I get in-memory access, but the moment I add a non-in-memory column, I don't use in-memory at all. I fall back straight away to just doing a non-in-memory access. In 21C, we have a thing called hybrid in-memory, which means even though I'm accessing information that is not in the in-memory store, because the rest of it is in the in-memory store, I'll get that information from in-memory, and then I'll go look up the information I need outside of in-memory using a hybrid format. So I'm using half in-memory, half not in-memory, as opposed to just abandoning in-memory entirely just because one column was not in the in-memory store. I should note, this only works if that information that's not in the in-memory store is in the select list. If, for example, I put description as a where clause, then yes, we will still fall back to no in-memory access. It's only when these columns that are not in the in-memory store are up in the select list that we can take advantage of hybrid in-memory. Let's see if we can get one more done and then we'll wrap it up. The final in-memory one I'll talk about is in-memory for new systems. If I've got a brand new application and I've just deployed it, what tables should I put into the in-memory store? It's hard to know. We don't know what the query patterns are like. We have a new thing called in-memory automatic level, which if you set to high, the database will decide based on the usage patterns which tables are best to put in the in-memory store. So it automatically populates information into there, and unlike normal in-memory, it will also automatically evict stuff. So things may come into the in-memory store, but other things may push them out, a bit more like the conventional buffer cache. It's important to note that when you turn this on, everything in your application becomes a candidate. So if you have particular tables you definitely do not want to be automatically populated, you would use the no in-memory clause on those particular tables or particular columns. You can see what the database is doing by looking at these views as well. So we almost got 21 features done. We got 16 done. I've jumped forward a whole jump of slides, but we'll wrap it up now because time is against us. As I said, we could have just covered 21 major new features, and you might be thinking, well, is that all that's in 21C? No, there is a massive list, and this is just some that I've picked there. There's literally all of these that weren't even in the slides. We've just, we didn't even get a chance to cover. There is plenty of stuff, plenty of innovative stuff in 21C. That's why you must use 21C to become familiar with these features, because the next long-term release, 23C, will have all those features in there, and we're expecting you to be familiar with them. You should be jumping out, playing with 21C in your development environments, using Express Edition if you have to. Make sure you become familiar with all the features and idiosyncrasies of 21C. But while you're doing that, make sure you're probably going with 19C for your production applications, because that's where the long-term support will be. So hopefully I've convinced you to both use 21C and to not use 21C. I'm out of time. Please stay in touch with me on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter, and I love talking about technology. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this session. Hopefully you have a fantastic rest of the Latin America conference. I wish I was there in person, mainly for the people, the food, and the wonderful community that Roland and his team have put together. So thank you very much for your time. I'll hand back now to the organizers. And if you have any questions, please contact me on Twitter. And until then, bye for now.